Today we are going to use much of our statistical knowledge to analyze some interesting education data using the technology tool CODAP. This is a summative lesson done after studying univariate data where we will cover many different high school Common Core standards. The standards included are shown on the screen, and they include representing data with box plots and dot plots, using statistics appropriate to compare the center and spread, and interpreting the difference in shape, center, and spread in the context of the data, and accounting for extreme data points like outliers. I hope you remember your investigative cycle: pose, collect, analyze, interpret, because we're going to be using that today. First, the question posed to us follows. The South and West seem like a great place to live because of the nice weather. But how do the regions compare in things like average teacher salaries or student per teacher ratio? Based on the average teacher salaries for states in the South and West, where would you prefer to teach and why? So next we would go to collecting the data. We have this great collection of data already given to us from 2015, and the link is there on the screen. And then we follow by analyzing and interpreting the data. So we're going to explore teacher salary and student per teacher ratio and other quantitative attributes to answer our posed question based on the data you have examined. In which region would you prefer to teach and why? So here is the data that you get in CODAP right here. And you'll see I have two maps and a graph open. And since we're doing it by region, I'm going to overlay the region on the map. And you can see this is the regions we're interested in. The orange is the West, including Alaska and little Hawaii. And the pink is the South. And I'm also going to put the region on the x-axis so you can see how many states are in each one. This includes 50 states and the District of Columbia. And I'm going to color code it just because I like the colors. So you can see the most are in the South and then the West. And we're not looking at the Northeast and the Midwest because they have colder weather. So I'm going to highlight them. You can see when I highlight, it highlights on all my maps and my tables. And I'm going to go to the eye and hide these selected cases so now we will not see them. In addition, if you want to look at the table by region, you can do a hierarchy and take the census region over here to the left. And again, we're not looking at the Northeast, so I'm going to minimize it, or the Midwest, so I'm going to minimize that. And now you can see all your South and West. And if I click on them, you can see it'll click on it over here. Okay, so first we want to examine by average salary. So I'm going to take this and put it on my x-axis here. And you can see it creates a dot plot. And I'm going to take the region and put it on this y-axis so it'll separate the dot plot so I can really examine them and compare them. So the first thing that I notice is that this seems to have a cluster, the South, with a few possible outliers over here. The West seems a little more spread out, or has more variation. To really examine this, a couple of things that we may want to look at. First, the mean, which is clearly higher in the West, closer to 54,000, than the South, which is closer to 51,000. But you can't just go on this data, the mean, and make a decision because the variation and other center information might skew the data. And so as we're looking at this, I'm going to put a box plot up here, and you can see the data is indeed skewed for both. You can see this one has a long tail on the right, and this also has some outliers over here. In fact, one of the outliers right here, the District of Columbia, is quite different than the rest of the data in the South. $73,000 versus the mean of 51 and the median of 49. So generally when data is skewed, we like to use the median as the center, because then the outliers, which pull the mean up, they're not pulling the median up. So it's a better representation of it. So look at the center here, almost 49,000 versus about 53. So if you're going on that, you could say, well, I'd like to move to the West because it has a higher average salary. And you'd be partially correct, but keep in mind, because of this variation, there's a lot of uncertainty with this because there is so much variation. So yes, you could have many states that have a higher average salary, but you could also end up down here with a lower average salary. So keep in mind that it does depend on more than just the average or the center. Okay, I'm also going to overlay it on my map down here so I can see it and really be able to envision the West. You can see the West right here including Alaska. And you can see there's a lot of darker red over here in the West, which means they have higher salaries. And the South is a lot lighter down here, which generally means a little bit lower. So going by this, as a whole, it does look like the West has a higher salary. I also put the standard deviation here. Does not look terribly different. Remember, 68% of the data is between these two bars. I'm going to take that back off. Okay, so now we'd like to look at the students to teacher ratio. So as I go look at that, I'm going to come over, I'm going to put it down here, and I'm going to put it on the map at the same time. And I immediately notice on the map there's a lot of dark green over here in the West, which is very interesting. And you'll notice that means higher. Over here, it is clearly that the median and mean clearly higher. Almost 18 students per teacher as opposed to 15 in the South. By the way, look at this. This is interesting. The District of Columbia had the highest teacher salary and has the lowest student per teacher ratio. So if you're judging by these two, that one state-district is looking pretty darn good. You can also see just how much variation is here. Look at that. And so you can really tell how it runs from 12 all the way to 23. This is much more consistent, much less variability. And so much less uncertainty also in the South. You kind of know what you're going to get. The West, it really depends on where you are. So as you're looking at that, I'm also going to pull up standard deviation. You can really see how that variability is there because this is much more spread out. We're going from a little over 14 to about 21. Here, really most of the data is between 14 and 16. That's very close together. Okay, so based off of the average salary, we said maybe we would choose the West, although you could decide differently and validate your reason. There's maybe a couple others that we want to look at. One is expenditure per student. So I'm going to slide this over here. Because this is how much money they spend on the students. This includes supplies, technology, all that. So this can really make a teacher's job easier. And I'm looking at this pretty quickly. I see there's a couple outliers for both. I also see both of them have clusters of data right here in the center, kind of around 10, 11,000. And here, kind of around the 10,000, 9, 10,000 range. It looks like they spend a little bit more in the West, but remember, it's got a couple outliers here really pulling the data up. So keep that in mind, especially Alaska. Alaska spends a lot, 19,000 per student, which is very interesting. So maybe this would help you decide, although I'm not sure it is a pure deciding factor. It might just show you that if there are some states that are much higher than others. And that, again, the South has a very consistent area right here. Another one I'm looking at as a teacher is the number of high school grads, because you want there to be a lot of support and a lot of students to graduate. So if you look right here, it's very interesting that all this data is very clustered here and here. So a lot under 100,000 for both, with a little more variability in the West than in the South. A couple of really high cases. Let's see. California, let's put that down here, Texas, and Florida, all pretty high. So what's interesting about this is all those states have pretty high populations. So maybe this is where in our investigative cycle, we need to go collect more data again. And instead of using the number of high school grads, we might need a percentage. Because right now it looks like that's just showing us that there's a lot of people in those states, and it may not really be giving us information. So that's where you can go through your investigative cycle and keep going. So as I'm looking at this, I'm not sure this is really representative of how good anything is in those states as opposed to just how big the states are. So if we go back to our original question, in which region would you prefer to teach and why? I think everyone might answer it a little differently based on all this information. I live in the South and would tend to pick the South, but I'm looking at the West and some of the West data looks pretty good. So it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts on this are. Thank you for joining me for this mini lesson today.